Wars in Gulf countries, human rights crumble beneath the boots of dictators. Whole regions sink into chaos, and yet the world barely blinks. But when violence erupts in the Middle East, especially around Gaza, suddenly the world stops to watch. Why? Is it about money? No. The wealthy oil states commit their share of atrocities, yet the world politely looks away. Is it religion or ancient history? Maybe. But most people can't even point to these sacred places on a map. The truth is far more sinister. We are trapped in the aftershocks of the Cold War, a secret battle of narratives planted decades ago. The Soviet Union may be dead, but its stories still rule us. We repeat slogans written in Moscow without even knowing it. My name is Elvira Bari. Born in the Soviet Union, I know firsthand how powerful propaganda can be. Today, I'll uncover exactly how the Kremlin planted its seeds of influence across the Middle East. Seeds that still shape the way millions of Westerners see the region. What exactly did Russians want in the Middle East? Historically, their interest rested on three pillars. First, support for Orthodox religious missions in the Holy Land. Second, access to military bases in the Eastern Mediterranean to protect vital trade routes. Third, and perhaps most importantly, rivalry with the West. Long before red flags flew over the Kremlin, Russian pilgrims trudged toward Jerusalem. By the mid-19th century, as many as 7,000 a year braved the long and dangerous journey to bow before the Holy Sepulchre. To shelter them, the Russian Palestine Society bought land and built what locals still call the Russian compound, grand stone courtyards that served as hostels for pilgrims. It was not only about faith. Nobles and merchants brought money. Their presence meant income for church coffers and for Russia's consular budgets. Supporting orthodoxy was more than piety, it was political glue. Because in truth, Russian society was fragmented. The elites didn't even speak Russian at home. They spoke French. Between rulers and ruled, there was no unifying bond except the Orthodox faith. Without it, the empire would have looked like what it really was, a colonial occupation. So orthodoxy became the banner of the regime. Inside the empire, it meant restricting other religions, especially Judaism. Abroad, it meant military and diplomatic campaigns to defend Orthodox holy sites and Orthodox Slavic peoples. But for those people, it brought no prosperity. Their lands became battlefields where two great empires, Ottoman and Russian, clashed over prestige and territory. The peasants back home, two-thirds of them illiterate, barely understood the reasons. They only wanted one thing, that ours would defeat theirs. And Russia needed to win, because the empire's budget depended heavily on grain exports. Yet the Ottomans controlled the straits, the narrow gates between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. When your enemy controls your lifeline, you either bow or fight. So they fought. Again and again. The Ottoman Empire was weakening. It never managed to industrialize. So Russia extracted concessions piece by piece. That ensured relatively steady grain exports, which in those days were as critical as oil is today. But world politics was never been driven only by trade or religion. It has also been driven, perhaps more than anything, by the ancient instinct of male rivalry. I've made another video about this, and I encourage you to watch it, because once you understand how these ancient behavioral patterns shape decisions, the world map suddenly makes sense. For men of the hunter personality archetype, life itself feels meaningless without the thrill of victory. At home, if their power is unchallenged, they instinctively look abroad for rivals. They crave the contest, the fight, the prize. And they'll dress it up however they must, in faith, in patriotism, in economic necessity, but beneath the noble words is something raw and primal, the desire for a duel. And because they value their own ambitions above the lives of others, they feel entitled to sacrifice people in the name of a holy cause. That was the mindset of Russian elites throughout the 19th century, and not only Russia's. Britain, France, Austria, they all played the same game. From the palaces of London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, it looked almost like sport. Orders given, dispatches read, maps covered in flags and arrows. Men in epaulets, posing proudly over the chessboard of the world. They never carried the burden of their choices. Others did the dying. That is why Russian emperors entangled themselves in the Middle East, not just for religion, not just for trade, but because it was part of the great game. And the thrill of beating their rivals was a reward in itself. Before we move to the next part, how the Soviet Union shaped Middle Eastern narratives that still define how we in the West see the region today, I want to thank you for supporting this channel. You can do so with a super thanks or buying me a coffee. This channel exists because of you. It's my full-time work, and your support makes it possible. And if you're fascinated by Russian history, let me give you a tip. The best way to truly understand Russia is through literature. Textbooks give you facts. Stories give you lives. That's why I wrote my Russian Treasures series. Carefully researched novels that immerse you in worlds most Western readers never knew existed. They are on Amazon, waiting for you. Now, let's return to the Middle East. We cannot talk about Russia's role in the Middle East without first looking at the Jews. At the turn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire held the largest Jewish community on earth, over 5 million people in 1897, more than half of all Jews worldwide. This was not by design. For centuries, Jews had migrated across North Africa and Europe, refusing to assimilate or abandon their faith. Many eventually settled in what is now Ukraine and Belarus because local rulers allowed them. Then those lands fell to the Russian Empire. And because Russia believed it had a sacred duty to defend orthodoxy, the Jews quickly found themselves pushed to the margins. They were restricted in education, in movement, in careers. They paid heavier taxes. And then came the pogroms of the 1880s. Waves of violence that convinced many young Jews there was no safety, no equality unless they built a homeland of their own in Palestine. At that point, Jewish youth split into two camps. Some dreamed of revolution inside Russia, tearing down the old system and building a just state. Others dreamed of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, then under British control. Those who chose Palestine began raising money to buy land and establish the first Jewish settlements, seedlings that decades later would grow into the State of Israel. Those who chose socialism found themselves in official positions inside the young Soviet Union. They were literate, organized, and the old Russian bureaucracy had been wiped out by civil war. For a moment, it seemed as if Jews might finally find a place inside the new system. But the Soviet economy collapsed again and again under its own laws. And when it did, ordinary citizens pointed the finger. The Jews are to blame. Waves of anti-Semitism returned, sometimes quiet, sometimes vicious, but always there. By the late 1940s, many Jews were desperate to leave the Soviet Union, especially after Israel was founded in 1948. But to the Kremlin, this was outrageous. How could people want to leave the most progressive and happy country in the world? Travel abroad in the USSR was a mark of privilege. It meant access to goods and luxuries unimaginable for ordinary citizens. And the idea that Soviet Jews should enjoy that privilege enraged the KGB. So the state did everything possible to keep them trapped. Meanwhile, the Jewish lobby in the United States did everything it could to get them out because Israel desperately needed new citizens after 6 million Jews had been slaughtered during the Holocaust. Here lies a cruel irony. The USSR actually supported the creation of Israel in 1948. Why? Because by then the Cold War was raging and Moscow wanted to strike a blow against Britain, which still controlled Palestine. But the Israelis had no intention of building socialism. And the Soviet Union couldn't give them what they truly needed to survive. Yes, Moscow could send weapons left over from the Second World War, but money to rebuild the nation? Impossible. The Soviet economy lay in ruins, its war-scorched territories still struggling to recover. That is why Israel turned to the only power that could provide it a lifeline, the USA. To the Kremlin, it felt like betrayal. And from that moment, Soviet policy hardened. At home, the state unleashed a flood of anti-Israel propaganda. Abroad, it armed and funded every enemy of Israel it could find. That pattern lasted for decades, and its echoes still shape how millions of people view the Middle East today. After the Soviet Union abandoned orthodoxy as its unifying idea, it needed something else, something simple, powerful, and impossible to argue against. Something that would divide the world into us and them at a single glance. And they found it. Anti-colonialism. It was brilliant. On the Middle East stage, it played like wildfire. The narrative united unlikely allies, hardened socialists and Islamists dreaming of the golden age of Arab civilization, when the Arab world had been the most advanced, literate, and powerful force in the region. People longed to restore that greatness. Moscow knew exactly what to do. Gather the enemies of Israel and therefore of the United States into one coalition with the USSR at the helm. Win even one convincing victory, and you could claim the moral high ground in the eyes of the world community. But to draw allies in, you needed a story, a narrative so clear, so emotionally charged that anyone who supported you instantly became the good guy, and anyone who opposed you, the villain. The trick was simple. Offer the world a formula. Declare it absolute good. Erase anything that contradicted it as irrelevant. Anti-colonialism. What could be against it? And you didn't have to look too closely at the liberators who replaced the colonizers. Their power struggles, their corruption, their cruelty to their own people, and the aid they siphoned away into private pockets. If anyone dared to point that out, the answer was ready. Oh, so you want these poor nations to remain under the boot of evil colonizers? And suddenly, there were only two choices on the table. Oppression by Western colonial powers, or oppression by local warlords and corrupt elites bought and paid for by some other country. Everything else disappeared from the discussion. But the narrative, no matter how powerful, needs carriers, messengers, and Moscow knew where to find them. In the West, countless intellectuals were hungry for recognition. Their books barely sold, their ideas rarely found an audience. They weren't athletes or actors, just clever, restless minds yearning for validation and, if we are honest, the attention of beautiful women. Then, suddenly, they were invited to special events, treated with admiration, told how brilliant, how sensitive, how refined they were. A mysterious woman appeared, speaking their language with a charming accent. New connections opened doors. Small publications printed their work. The pay wasn't huge, but enough to ease the struggle. They had become part of a circle, a world where they were admired, welcomed, and for once, truly listened to. And that world opened doors they never imagined. Invitations to Poland, to Czechoslovakia, or even to the mysterious, magnetic Russia, always under the banner of cultural exchange. There, they were treated like stars. Lavish dinners, ballet at the Bolshoi, lectures before wide-eyed students who looked at them as if they were demigods. Were they recruited agents? No. Were they paid by the KGB? Not directly. They were simply fighting for peace, justice, and anti-colonialism. They defended the narratives of Middle Eastern struggle, narratives carefully seeded by respected mentors or sympathetic editors. Few of them had ever seen the region for themselves. Fewer still had the time or will to question what was real. In their world, repeating the right message wasn't just safe, it was virtuous. A kind of moral badge. This is good. This is evil. And if you want to be accepted, respected, and heard, you knew what gospel to recite. They never saw the truth that the entire celebration was paid for by Moscow with money squeezed from the Soviet people who could barely afford their food and clothing. But they didn't want to see it, because inside their circle, inside their cause, they finally felt what they had craved all along: meaning, recognition, and belonging. Bingo. The Soviet Union could never hope to outcompete the West in economics. Its factories produced tanks faster than tractors, and its stores had more slogans than winter boots. But the anti-colonial narrative gave Moscow another weapon. When Western lenders hesitated to fund Egypt's Aswan High Dam, Khrushchev swept in. $100 million credit line, thousands of Soviet engineers, enough cement to bend the Nile itself. From the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, Moscow poured over $1 billion worth of bombers, tanks, and radar systems into Egypt and Syria, paid for not with cash, but with cotton and rice. Back home, ordinary Soviet citizens lived in obvious poverty, queuing for bread and dreaming of basic comforts. But the elites didn't notice. They were too busy forging alliances meant to show Americans and Israel who was boss. Meanwhile, in training camps under Moscow's supervision, young Arab militants drilled in guerrilla warfare. They learned how to handle modern weapons, how to plant explosives, and how to fight a war that never ended. All of it wrapped in the banner of anti-colonial struggle. But in truth, it wasn't about freedom. It was about ensuring peace never came, because in the Eastern Mediterranean, peace was bad business. Local rulers learned the lesson quickly. Present yourself as a threat, and you got money, weapons, and influence. Seek compromise, and you risk being toppled by rivals armed and funded from abroad. Let's be clear, not everything in the Middle East was scripted in Moscow. The Muslim world had its own rivalries. Turkey, Iran, the oil kingdoms of the Gulf all had interests and agendas. But the fact remains. The Kremlin pushed hard to turn every spark into a fire, every scratch into a wound that never healed. The Soviet Union backed the Arabs in every war against Israel, and when that failed to deliver victory, Moscow shifted tactics. In the second part of the 20th century, literacy rates had soared. People listened to the radio, watched television, and read newspapers. In democratic countries, public opinion now had the power to shape policy, so the Kremlin set out to shape that opinion. Keep the anti-colonial struggle alive. Stir outrage. Make sure the Middle East was always a wound the world could not ignore. Create a world where anger earns social prestige, while compromise cost you everything. And to sustain this storm, you needed resources. Money for propaganda, bribes for officials, salaries for useful activists, weapons for fighters, false passports printed not in back rooms, but on state-owned presses. And most of all, you needed terror. Hijackings, hostage-takings, acts so shocking that Israel was forced to strike back. And every strike deepened the cycle of violence. If there's one place in the Middle East where Moscow has planted its flag and refused to let go, it is Syria. The partnership began in the 1950s. The Cold War was heating up, and Washington was cementing alliances with Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Moscow needed a foothold and found it in Damascus. The Syrian rulers were eager. They wanted weapons to fight Israel and to strengthen their shaky regime. The Soviets were happy to provide them. Tanks rolled off ships in Latakia. MiGs screamed over desert skies. Thousands of Syrian officers trained in Soviet academies, while Russian advisors set up bases and camps on Syrian soil. The relationship deepened after Egypt's Anwar Sadat broke away from Moscow in the 1970s and turned to Washington. Suddenly, Syria was the last Arab ally the Soviet could fully trust. And trust meant investment. Billions in arms, engineers to build infrastructure, secret police training, another export the Kremlin specialized in. For decades, Syria gave Moscow what it craved, a presence in the eastern Mediterranean. The Tartus naval facility, opened in 1971, was the jewel in the crown. Small by Western standards, but symbolically priceless. Russia's only warm water port outside the Soviet Union. Then came the collapse of the USSR. Funding dried up. Russian ships stopped calling at Tartus. For a while, it looked like the bond might dissolve. But history had other plans. When Syria plunged into civil war in 2011, Bashar al-Assad was on the verge of collapse. Western leaders demanded he step down. Rebel groups closed in on Damascus, and then, in 2015, Russia intervened. Its warplanes launched from Khmeimim airbase near Latakia, striking rebel positions. Russian advisors helped stabilize Syrian forces. Putin claimed it was about fighting terrorism, but the real aim was to save Assad and reassert Russia's role in the region. But when Russia became bogged down in its full-scale war in Ukraine, it could no longer support Assad at the same level. His regime collapsed, and the dictator was forced to flee to Moscow. Today, the positions of Russia's military bases in Syria is precarious. During the Cold War, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies were everything the Soviet Union despised. Western aligned, oil-rich, deeply religious, and firmly anti-communist. Moscow backed their enemies, Iraq, Syria, and Nasser's Egypt. The Gulf states, in turn, pumped oil into global markets and helped drive down prices, weakening the Soviet economy. But time and desperation changed everything. After the fall of the USSR, Russia no longer had the luxury of picking enemies based on ideology. It needed partners. Russia's partnership with OPEC Plus began in 2016 when it joined forces with Saudi Arabia and other producers to stabilize oil prices after a global glut. The cooperation was historic. For the first time, a non-OPEC giant aligned with the cartel to manage supply. Over the years, the alliance, known as OPEC Plus, has used coordinated production cuts and increases to influence global markets. Today, amid sanctions and falling revenues from its war in Ukraine, Russia remains deeply reliant on OPEC Plus ties. But tensions are visible. In August 2025, the group agreed to a major output increase to regain market share, pushing prices down toward the mid-$60 and raising questions about whether Russia can meet its quotas while financing its costly war. When war broke out in Ukraine, many wealthy Russians needed to vanish, and fast. Western sanctions froze their assets, banned flights, and imposed travel restrictions in Europe and America. But Dubai opened its arms. Although no official data exists, research suggests that several 100,000 Russians acquired UAE residency from 2022 to 2024. Russians have emerged as one of the top nationalities among property buyers, investing billions in residential real estate. In Dubai's elite districts, Marina Bay, Palm Jumeirah, and downtown, Russians are everywhere. Chefs launch high-end Russian restaurants. Private bankers, real estate agents, and crypto consultants scramble to serve oligarchs, tech entrepreneurs, influencers, and businessmen finding ways around sanctions. With the Kremlin floundering in Ukraine, Russia's elites looked to preserve capital, and Dubai became one of the few accessible lifelines. If this video opened your eyes, if it helped you understand the hidden threads connecting Russia to today's Middle East, then please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps the story reach more people who desperately need to hear it. And a special note, at the end of this video, you'll see the closing credits featuring all the incredible viewers who've given my channel a super thanks. Your generosity makes this deep dive storytelling possible. If you'd like to join them, just click the super thanks button below or buy me a coffee using the link in the description. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your curiosity. And remember, the truth is always deeper than the headlines.